We're in this series on the I am statements of Jesus. Kind of the premise of this going into it was that we are in a political season where everybody is trying to reframe who they are. They're trying to now kind of make, they're trying to win votes in the political world. They're trying to convince people who they are, even though history would say differently or whatever. And so they're trying to rebrand themselves and tell you who they are. And by the way, tomorrow I think is the last day to register to vote in the state of Texas. And so if you haven't registered, you should do that. Voting is our civil right and responsibility, and I believe this election is a big one, not just in the presidential election, but in our state and local election as well. And so you should vote. I'm not telling you how to vote or who you should vote for, but I think you should really seek the Lord in the direction that He wants you to vote and investigate the candidates and find out who they are. I felt that as a pastor of a church, it would be more important for us to investigate who Jesus says He is. Because at the end of the day, whatever candidate wins or loses or whatever, we need Jesus. And we need the truth of who Jesus is and who He says He is, who He claimed to be when He walked this earth, who He continues to claim to be in His promises, and what that means for us today. So last week we looked at the first one, I am the bread of life. And by the way, I will do my best to not make any Italy references. It's been over a week now since I've been back, and so we won't go there. So everybody breathe easily. We're going to get into John chapter 8, verse 12. As Jesus said, I am the light of the world. This is the second one, the second I am statement. I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will not walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. Light, of course, is essential for our lives, as much as, perhaps even more so, than bread. Being scared of the dark is one of our most primal fears. Not that long ago in a message, I shared with you my complicated relationship with darkness. As a child, I was afraid of the dark. I shared a story about a plant in a hallway that I knew was going to kill me. And so I thought, I've already shared that story. I'll share with you another quick story about my complicated relationship with darkness and some of my childhood trauma that has formed who I am today. When I was in the 6th grade, I had a good friend, Matt Muncie. I had a group of friends, but Matt's mom, Nancy, was a single mom, and she was a fun mom. And so we always tried to do sleepovers at their house because she would let us get away. Sometimes she would drive us to Teepee, our 6th grade teacher's house. Like at one time, the cops got called, and we were like all hiding in somebody's yard. And the cops tell us to come out of the yard. And my friend Matt's mom knew the cop because she grew up in the town. And so she came over and talked him out of getting us in trouble. And this is fun, Mom. And this is, by the way, why you shouldn't let your kids have sleepovers. But Matt's mom let us go out in the middle of the night into the woods. She didn't care. And so this group of friends, so I thought that I had, wanted to take me snipe hunting. And if you don't know what snipe hunting is, then you're fortunate enough to not have ever been on a snipe hunt, but I'm about to ruin it for you. The group of us were told, or I was told, that to go snipe hunting, it had to be in the middle of the night, that these little ground birds, like, they only walk on the ground, which should have been my first clue, that they're a bird that can only walk, but they would come out at night, and the whole premise of this is that you get some poor soul, you hand them a pillowcase and a baseball bat, and you take them out into the woods, and you tell this sap that, hey, we're going to go scare the snipe out of the bushes, and you're going to be there gathering them in the pillowcase, and then when they're in there, you hit them over the head with a baseball bat. And the idea is that once you get them out into the middle of the woods, everybody else that's in on it, they go back to the house. And they leave you standing in the middle of the woods in the middle of the night. And I happen to be that poor sap on this specific night. Once it happens to you, you're really eager to do it to somebody else. But when it happens to you, it's really, embarrassing because you want to be cool, you want to fit in, and I so desperately wanted to fit in, and I didn't. And so here it's happening to me, and the most awful part of that experience was the darkness, right? The middle of the night, the pitch blackness that I was experiencing. And I did make my way back to the house. I lived. I made it. I know that just in case you weren't clear. But I did make it, but it did traumatize me to darkness. Darkness is synonymous with chaos and confusion. Growing up for me, in order for me to feel safe at night, I needed one thing: the soft glow of either a nightlight or a cracked door or something that would bring light into the darkness. And interestingly, today, like my parents, when Kelly and I sleep at night, we can't have any light in our room, right? I don't know if you've ever been like in a hotel room and they have like the light from a TV or the light of an alarm system or a smoke detector, and it's like you've got to like put something over that because it's seemingly lighting up the entire room. I can't have any light now, but when I was a kid, I needed some sort of light in the darkness. We associate light today with honesty and integrity. When some sort of financial wrongdoing is uncovered, what do we say? We say that we bring it into what? Into the light, right? When someone lies, we talk about bringing the truth to light. By the way, why is it so hard for politicians to just admit when they lie? I'm not making any statements about anyone. I think they all do it. But I just wonder, like, why couldn't one of them just say, you know what? I know I said that. I lied. I let fear get the best of me, and fear moved me to lie about that circumstance and that situation and to say something that wasn't true. I'm sorry that I allowed that to take place. Like, if that ever happened, sign me up. I'll vote for that. I'll run on that ticket. If we could just get back to some common sense and some normality and some honesty, man, I would definitely vote for that. All right. This is not a political message today, but I am feeling a little feisty when it comes to those things these days. So light brings beauty. Every kid in the 5th grade knows, that went to science class, learns that all of the beauty that we see all around us, all of the colors are a result of a reflected light. Color is literally light. And of course, we know that light is literally essential for life. Without life, major parts of the food chain would be disrupted, and life on this earth as we know it would cease to exist. And one more thing that I think is especially interesting is we now know that light is somehow fundamental to existence itself. Albert Einstein's famous theory of relativity, which, by the way, is so complex that only Albert Einstein, myself, and a handful of other physicists really understand this. It was premised on the constancy of light. His famous E equals mc squared, E meaning energy, m is mass, and c stands for constant, which is the speed of light, because it never changes. Energy and mass are variable, but Einstein would say speed and time. He would say that speed and time are relative, but light never changes. It's constant. It's literally what undergirds existence. All of that to say, it's really hard to imagine a more bold and audacious claim for Jesus to make than I am the light of the world. I am the color of the world. I am the life, the constant that holds all of life together. I am the safety. I am the beauty. Well, just as Jesus' claim to be the bread of life we had to have context to understand that, to understand the fullness of this meaning, of understanding this, what Jesus is saying when he is saying, I am the light of the world. We have to look at what's happening around this statement when Jesus sets it up. So first, let's just consider the setting. In John chapter 7, verse 37, John tells us that this claim occurred at the last night of the Feast of Tabernacles. Okay, so the Feast of Tabernacles was a 7-day feast. It was often referred to as the Feast of Booths or the Feast of Tents. In the Hebrew, it's the Sukkot. There were 3 primary rituals that would take place that were associated with this feast. The first is that everybody in Israel came to Jerusalem and they lived in little tents, right? These little tabernacles, these little booths, if you will. The word means the same thing. And they did this to commemorate this long season of wandering in the wilderness where they lived in tents, right? And God led them out of Egypt to the promised land. And so they had their little mini Woodstock all the time without the drugs and without all, but like they all slept in tents and they were all there. And then second, every night they poured out water onto the ground as a reminder to them of the time that God provided water, where Moses hits the rock and water comes gushing out of it. And then the third thing that they did was they lit this enormous candelabra that sat directly in front of the temple. And this giant candelabra was so big that when it was lit, the light flooded the city. The temple orchestra would play and the people would dance before the Lord. So they lit this gigantic lamp to commemorate how God led them through the wilderness with the cloud by day and the fire by night. Right? The pillar of light was God's presence with them. It lit their way in the midst of darkness. It split the Red Sea. It shielded them from the pursuing Egyptians. And then when God gave them the law on Mount Sinai, that cloud covered the mountain in thunder and in flame. And when Israel built the tabernacle, the house of the Ark of the Covenant, that cloud covered it. It was always there following the ark, whether it was sometimes a cloud of light or a cloud and sometimes the light of fire. It was always with them. And so to commemorate this part of the Exodus, every night of the festival, they lit this giant candelabra, except for on the last night. See, everyone on the last night is putting their tent back together. They're packing up. They're getting ready to leave and go home the next morning. And scholars say that the last night of the feast was always eerie because you had this big, cold, dark candelabra, this big dead lamp in front of the temple because they hadn't taken it down yet. And it served as almost this unintentional reminder that the actual cloud of God's glory had not been seen in the Jewish temple for centuries. Where had it gone? It's a great question. I'm so glad that you asked that this morning. Let me tell you, it's in Ezekiel chapter 10. The prophet Ezekiel proclaimed that because Israel had sinned and turned from God so many times, that if they didn't turn back from God, God's presence and glory would depart from them permanently. Israel didn't listen to Ezekiel, so Ezekiel says, chapter 10, that he saw God's glory lift up from its place in the temple, move towards the door of the temple to the threshold, and it stops at the temple threshold and hesitates for a moment. Almost as to say, I don't want to leave, but I know I must. And then the glory cloud of God's presence goes out of the east gate of Jerusalem, very important, east gate of Jerusalem, and Ezekiel saw it move up the Mount of Olives and disappear into the sky forever. From that point onward, the glory was gone. The Israelites had a term for it. It was called Ichabod. Literally meaning no. The I in that meaning in the Hebrew, no, and kabod meaning glory, that there was no glory, that the glory is gone. And so every year in Israel, on the last night of the feast, when the candelabra was extinguished, a quiet despair fell over Israel, and they wondered, when will the light of God's glory return to us? And now, on the last night of the feast, with that background, Jesus stands in the temple in front of this giant, dark candelabra and says, I am the light of the world. I am God's protection, His presence, His beauty, His glory. I'm back. And He's standing at the mouth of the temple. So with that backdrop, as we think about that, let's consider the presumption that Jesus is making of this claim, and then we're going to take a look at the promise, or to some, the problem of this claim. Number one, the presumption of his claim. Last week I mentioned that there is this convenient myth that seems to be growing. It's been a part of our universities. It's been being peddled in a lot of different environments, but it's certainly becoming more and more true through social media and stuff that the true Jesus, the real Jesus, the one who actually wandered around Jerusalem, was likely just an itinerant moral teacher. He was a good one, a societal revolutionary, maybe even a messenger with a special connection to some sort of divinity, similar to that of Buddha or Abraham or Muhammad or Confucius. But he didn't think of himself as God. And that claim, they like to say, was kind of a legend that was imposed on Jesus later on. And some Christian cults, like the Mormons or the Jehovah's Witnesses, would say that Jesus never claimed to be God. And what I'm starting to see more and more in my threads and in social media is people peddling this idea that Jesus never claimed to be God. And you may have heard this as well. And so I just think it's really important for us to understand that that's not true. Jesus did claim to be God. In fact, Jesus' claim to be God was central to his teaching in the book of John. It's the core of what he's saying in moments like this, when he's saying, I am. Not just by using the name I am, which is significant in itself, but the whole imagery behind it. He was saying, I was the voice speaking in the burning bush. I was the cloud of God's presence that led you through the wilderness. I was the glory that dwelt in the Holy of Holies. All of those manifestations that Moses called God, that was me. And they knew exactly what he was saying, because in verse 20 it says that they tried to arrest him. If all he was a false prophet, or if all he was just some moral teacher, why would they try to arrest him? Right? Why would they arrest him if he was just claiming to be this unusually insightful teacher? But it was because he was claiming to be God. And in fact, just a few minutes later in the discussion, the Pharisees tell Jesus he shouldn't be claiming such things. He shouldn't be claiming that kind of authority for himself. And this is what he says in verse 56. Your father Abraham rejoiced that he would see my day. He saw it and was glad. So the Jews said to him, you are not 50 years old, and have you seen Abraham? Jesus said to them, truly, truly, I say to you, before Abraham was, I am. Not before Abraham was, I was, but before Abraham was, I am. And in verse 59, so they picked up stones to throw at him, but Jesus hid himself and went out of the temple. When they were picking up, why were they picking up stones? Not because he was using bad grammar, right? Like it seems like bad grammar, but because in saying before Abraham was, I am, he is claiming to be God, and that was blasphemous. The other variation of this myth is that these kinds of bold claims by Jesus to deity occur only in the Gospel of John. Right? There are some scholars or some professors that will say, well, that this is limited to the Gospel of John, and John presents Jesus differently than the other Gospel writers. And the reasoning for this goes like this, that in the earliest written Gospels, Mark, Matthew, and Luke, that's where we find Jesus, the moral revolutionary, and it's in John that some will say that John puts all of the big kind of God stuff into his book, and that was written years and years later. But again, that's not true either, for two reasons. First, John's gospel wasn't written that much later than the Gospels. Yes, it was written later, but it was still written in the first generation of Christian followers. And second, and probably more importantly, the other gospel writers most certainly put forward Jesus' divinity. They do prefer to let people discover his divinity a little bit differently, right? Just as Jesus really wanted people to discover he was God through what he did, not just what he said. Anybody can just claim to be God, right? Anybody could do that, but Jesus wanted to demonstrate it and let people arrive at that conclusion on their own. For example, let me just give it to you. It is there in Matthew and Mark. Jesus says this: tear down this temple, he says, and what? I will raise it up in 3 days. And Matthew and Mark both note that in saying that, Jesus was talking about himself. For the Jews, the temple was the place where God dwelt. And so for Jesus to say, I'm the new temple, right? That's a pretty strong claim to divinity, I would say. Or how about this? In all three of the Gospels, Jesus forgave sins. And when the Pharisees confronted him and objected, saying, listen, you can't say that. You can't forgive sins. Only God can forgive sins. Jesus doesn't dispute their reasoning. He just goes ahead and kind of doubles down by healing someone. He heals a lame man that can't walk and says, if I've got the power to make a lame man walk, which we only know God can do, then maybe you should believe me when I say that I can forgive sins also. Matthew and Luke both record 5 different times, mostly towards the end of Jesus' life, where the disciples begin to worship Jesus, something Jews would have believed was only reserved for God himself. So yes, the other gospel writers put Jesus' deity at the forefront. They just develop it a little bit differently than John, but it's there. So all of that means that the idea that Jesus was one of history's great lights, just a moral teacher who had perhaps some sort of connection to deity like others, though popular among our universities and college professors, it's just simply not true. Ironically, probably one of the greatest theologians to ever walk this earth gives us the most modern assessment of the divinity of Jesus, and that would be U2's Bono. Right? I can't believe I'm quoting him, but he gets it. This is what he says in an interview with his biographer. He says this: the secular response to the Christ story always goes like this. He was a great prophet, obviously a very interesting guy, had a lot to say along the lines of other great prophets, be they Elijah, Muhammad, Buddha, or Confucius. But actually, Christ says, no, I'm not saying I'm a teacher. Don't call me a teacher. I'm not saying I'm a prophet. I'm saying I'm God incarnate. And people say, no, please just be a prophet. A prophet we can take. You're a bit eccentric, but we've had John the Baptist eating locusts and wild honey. We can handle that, but not God, not the Messiah. Because, we're going to have to crucify you if you say that. And he goes, no, I actually am the Messiah. At this point, everyone starts staring at their shoes and says, oh my God, he's going to keep saying this. So what you're left with, and this is Bono speaking, what you're left with is either Christ, who was who he said he was, God incarnate, the Messiah, or a complete nutcase. And I mean, we're talking nutcase on the level of Charles Manson. I'm not joking here. He says the idea that the entire course of civilization for over half of the globe could have its fate changed and turned upside down by a nutcase, he says, for me, that's far-fetched. And I would just add, it seems like Bono finally found what he was looking for. See what I did there? This is terrible. It's terrible, right, Brent? This is bad. This is bad. It is bad. Jesus claimed to be light, the very radiance of God's glory. And so that's the presumption of his claim. And now we turn to the promise or the problem of his claim. As I explained, Jesus not only claims to be the great I am in the Gospel of John, he attaches that name to our greatest areas of brokenness and need. And so what is the need met by this claim? How does Jesus, as the light of the world, how does that benefit me personally today? John answers that by sandwiching this claim between two different stories. Last week we had a miracle sandwich. We've got another one this week. The first is John chapter 8, verse 1 through 11. And I will just let you know, and I think it's important, anytime there's confusion or some sort of variance when it comes to the Scripture, I think it's important to just inform about that. And this is one of those things. Many scholars say that this story that I'm about to read or that I'm about to reference is most likely not in the original manuscripts, that it was added later on. But the reality is there's no question that this story was passed around in the early church, and the story is so incredibly consistent with how John talks about Jesus being the light of the world in his first letter to the church in 1 John 1. 1 John 1, that doesn't make any sense, in John 1 or in 1 John. And even though this story may not have been in the original manuscript, I think it can still be used here for this context. And the story goes like this. You've probably heard it. Even if you've not grown up in the church, you've probably heard Christians talk about this or have some concept of this. But the idea is that there was a woman who was brought to Jesus. She had just been caught in the very act of adultery. Scripture doesn't say, or the story doesn't say anything about the man, so presumably he was let off of this, which is just terrible in and of itself, that he was, left to go free. But this woman is drug out into the streets. She was dragged out into the streets because the consequence of adultery in that time for a woman was punishable by stoning, that they were going to stone her to death. And so the bottom line is there she stands, guilty. And in Israel, this stonable offense is there. And the Pharisees asked Jesus what he should do or what they should do in this scenario. This is not a sincere question. They just wanted to get Jesus on record either ordering a woman's death, right, or denying the law. It was a trap. It's like our modern day media. They don't ask sincere questions. It's just always a trap. They're trying to get you to say something that they can run with and be guilty of. Again, I don't know why I'm going down these rabbit trails, but I'm just just frustrated right now with our world. So instead of answering them, Jesus kneels down and he starts to draw in the dirt. And we don't exactly know what he's drawing down there. Some scholars believe that it was some sort of symbol in reference to the Ten Commandments. Some people have said they believe that he was writing out the names of the Pharisees. I think that's a little far-fetched, but certainly would cause them to rethink their stance on this. I think based upon what he says next, it was probably the latter, because after he was done, he stands up and he says, "Let him who is without sin cast the first stone." Realizing this wasn't going to be the hill these Pharisees were going to die on, and recognizing their own sin and guilt, each of the Pharisees drop their rocks and start walking away until all of them are gone, and the only people left are Jesus and this woman. And he says, "Where are your accusers?" And she says, "None remain, Lord," to which he responds with those beautiful words, "And neither do I then condemn you. Now go and sin no more." Here's the thing about light. Light exposes. Like this woman is exposed in her sin, like Jesus exposes the Pharisees. Listen, when something isn't pretty, what do we do with it? We hide it in the darkness, right? You prefer to keep it in the dark. The older I get, the less I like looking at myself in well-lit mirrors. Right? Now they have these mirrors that have a light around it, and it like magnifies your face. These were created by Satan himself. Amen, ladies? These are there to what? To highlight your blemishes and to highlight all of the bad parts of your face. Some people use the phrase that you're aging like a fine wine, and I heard this phrase recently. I thought it was pretty funny that I'm actually aging like a gallon of milk. Right? The older I get, the whiter and more chunky I am. That's funnier than the previous one. And so when I was in high school and into my freshman year of college, I don't share this story much, but I had terrible acne. Like really, really bad, like medication bad. I went on like one of the hardest medications that you can put a child on, and I think eventually they went into a class action lawsuit for it and all of these things. But it was just terrible, and I would cry myself to sleep at night. I would never want to look at myself in a mirror, certainly not a brightly lit mirror. And when I was a freshman in college, I still was struggling with it. I, by that time, was on medication, so it was helping a little bit. But as fate would have it, I found myself at a job. It was the only job I could get working at Sunglass Hut. If you've ever been in a Sunglass Hut, you know that thing is lit up like the light of day, and there are mirrors everywhere. It's not a huge store, so you can see every angle of your face in this place. And I hated it because it was just this daily reminder of all of the blemishes and all of the things that were on my face, and it was terrible. And as I was thinking about that time, when we see ourselves in the true light of God's glory, can you just imagine morally what we look like? So here's this woman caught in the very act of adultery, standing with the most morally pure being in the universe, completely exposed in all of her ugly shame. And that when sin is addressed, when it's truly addressed, because here's what happens. Oftentimes I'll end up in conversations with people who maybe have been caught in sin, or who there's a suspecting of some sort of sin issue in their life, or it's kind of exposed in marriage counseling or whatever. Here's oftentimes what happens is we are really good at partial confession. And what I mean by partial confession is, let me just tell you enough to make you think that I'm telling you all of it. And so partial confession is like a partial eclipse. There's a little bit of light, but there's still a whole lot of darkness that exists. And this woman is now in the midst of the full brightness of the Son of God. And light is shining in, and it brings this important question that we get to answer, and it is this about divine light. What is it like to stand completely exposed in all of your sin in the presence of Jesus? And the surprising answer is it's safe. In fact, it's the safest place in all of the universe. And that's because Jesus' light is not just a revealing light, his light is a healing light. In the book of 1 John, John says it this way in verse 7 and 9, if we walk in the light as he is in the light, that the blood of Jesus will cleanse us from all sin. And that if we confess our sin, he is faithful and just to forgive us of our sins and to cleanse us from all unrighteousness. In other words, it will bring our sin and our shame to Jesus. If we bring our sin and our shame to Jesus, like this woman did, he will forgive and he will cleanse us. The irony of the gospel is that if we expose and confess our sins to Jesus, he will cover them. But if you cover your sin, if we cover our sin from him, Jesus will one day expose and judge those. And I know what you might be thinking. You might be afraid to bring your guilt and your weakness and your failure and shame to Jesus. But here's the good news. It's safe. There's an old song, an old hymn. It says, there's a fountain filled with blood drawn from Emmanuel's veins, and sinners plunge beneath that flood, lose all their guilty stain. So back to the sandwich. On the front side of Jesus' claim is this beautiful picture of grace and forgiveness. And then on this other side, Jesus is healing a man born blind. And to make sure we connect this miracle to his claim to be the light of the world, Jesus actually repeats the claim and he says, I am the light of the world. And then he heals a man who everyone in the city knew was born blind. And there's irony there too. Because typically if you're in the presence of an intensely bright light, that light won't help you. It will probably blind you. In July of 2010, a scientist at the University of Sheffield in England discovered a star that they say, get this, is 10 million times brighter than the sun. Right? Can you even get your mind around that? 10 million times brighter than our sun. And they gave this star this beautiful creative name called R136A1.6. They gave this star this creative name, and we can't even look directly at our sun without it doing damage to our eyes. Can you imagine looking at something 10 million times more brighter than our sun? Right? You would go blind not even looking at it. I have a dog. Well, I don't have a dog. My wife has a dog. And it's a little Boston Terrier, and he's blind. He's not that old, but he's blind. You know why he's blind? Because he stares at the sun. He sits outside in the sun and he stares at it. And now he's got cataracts and he's blind. You know why? Because he's a dumb dog. The sun will blind you when you look directly at it. And all of these stars, Paul says, were created as these dim reflections of God's true glory. God's glory, Paul says, is the truly unapproachable light. And so if you understand this, in John chapter 9, we have the brightest of all lights. And instead of causing blindness, he heals it. Instead of judging and shaming sin, he forgave and covered it. I know you may feel this morning, depending on how you walked in this morning, you might feel too dirty, too damaged, too deceptive, too disqualified for Jesus. But listen to me when I tell you this. His light is sight-giving, not blinding. It's cleansing. It's not debilitating. Over the years, as we've sat with countless people who have understood the healing and delivering power of exposing their sin to Jesus. Cover your sin and he'll expose it and judge it one day. Expose it to him now and there is a cleanliness, a forgiveness that exists. The irony of the most brilliant light in the universe is not that it only reveals defilement, it heals it. That it doesn't cause blindness, it cures it. And that's because at the center of this light is a thing called the cross. It's this point of great darkness. Ezekiel, as I referenced in chapter 10, Ezekiel saw the light of God's presence leaving the table, hesitating at the threshold, departing from Jerusalem by the east gate, heading up the Mount of Olives, where he would seemingly ascend forever. Well, when Jesus makes his triumphal entry into Jerusalem, he takes the most unusual route. He first goes to the Mount of Olives, and then he rides a donkey down into Jerusalem where he enters it by what? By the east gate. And guess where the first place he went was? He went to the temple. The light had returned. But that week did not end with the light of the world enthroned in the Holy of Holies. It ended with him hung in shame on a cross. The gospel writers tell us that when Jesus died on the cross, that there's this unusual darkness that settled over the land in the middle of the day. That the curse of our sin and death had seemingly extinguished the light of the world. And then the light of the world was placed into a cold, dark, cavernous grave and sealed up for what we thought was forever. But thankfully, death could not hold him, and darkness could not overcome him. And so at dawn on the third day, just as the sun began to illuminate the day, the light of the world walked out of the grave. And that's why it's a healing light. That's why it's a forgiving light. Because the light of the world absorbed our darkness. The gospel message is simply look to Jesus, look to the light of the world, and be saved. I didn't share this story because I ran out of time, but you guys have till 2 o'clock today. So I have connection class, so I have to be brief. But I want to share this story of one of the greatest pastors that has ever lived, Charles Spurgeon. He was the pastor in the 19th century, and he describes his conversion of faith in these terms. And I just want to read it to you as quickly as I can. But Spurgeon said to his congregation one day, "I sometimes think I might still be in darkness today had it not been for the goodness of God in sending a snowstorm one Sunday morning when I was a teenager while I was trying to get to a certain place of worship. But the snow came fast and hard, and I couldn't get to the respectable church I was trying to get to, so I turned down a side street, and I came to a little primitive Methodist chapel. In that chapel, there were no more than a dozen or 15 people. I had heard of the primitive Methodists, how they sang so loudly that they made people's heads ache, but that didn't matter to me. I wanted to know how I might be saved. And if those primitive Methodists could tell me that, I did not care how much they made my head ache. But the minister did not come that morning. He had been snowed in, I suppose. And so in his place, a very thin-looking man, a shoemaker or tailor, got up to the pulpit to preach. Now, it is well that preachers should be instructed, but this man, he was really stupid. He stuck really closely to his text that morning for the simple reason that he had little else to say. The text was, "Look unto me and be ye saved, all the ends of the earth." He didn't even pronounce the words correctly, but that didn't matter because there was, I thought, a glimpse of hope for me in that text. And so after reading the text, the simple preacher began thus, "My dear friends, this is a very simple text indeed. It says, look." Well, a man needn't go to college to learn to look. Anyone can look, even a child can look. But the text also says, "Look unto me." "Aye," said he in a broad Essex accent. Many of you are looking to yourselves, but it's no use looking there. You'll never find any comfort in yourselves. The text says, "Look unto me." And the good man got on a roll, Spurgeon said. "Look unto me. I'm sweating great drops of blood. Look unto me. I'm hanging on a cross. Look unto me. I'm dead and buried. Look unto me. I rise again. Look unto me. I ascend to heaven. Look unto me. I'm sitting at the Father's right hand. Oh, poor sinner, look unto me. Look unto me." And then the preacher spied me under the balcony, and he must have recognized I was new to the church. And he said, "Young man, you look very miserable." Well, it was true, I did, but I was not accustomed to having remarks made from the pulpit about my personal appearance. However, it was a good blow, and it struck me deeply. He continued, "And you always will be miserable, young man, miserable in life, miserable in death, if you don't look to Jesus. Obey now, and this moment you will be saved." And lifting up his hands, he shouted, as only a primitive Methodist could do, "Young man, look to Jesus Christ. Look, look, look. You have nothing to do but to look and live." And I saw at once the way of salvation. I know not what else he said. I was so possessed with that one thought. Like as when the brazen serpent was lifted up, the people only looked and were healed. So it was with me. Oh, I looked and I looked until I could almost have looked my eyes away. There and then the cloud was gone. The darkness had rolled away, and at that moment I saw the sun. I could have risen that instance and sung with the most enthusiastic of them, of the precious blood of Christ and the simple faith which looks alone to him. Ever since by faith I saw the stream, thy flowing wounds supply. Redeeming love has been my theme and shall be till I die. Oh, that somebody had just told me this before. Look to Christ and you shall be saved. Look to Jesus and be ye saved, all ye ends of the earth. So let me end with a question for you who are not yet Christians, and a challenge for those of you who are. For the not yet convinced, maybe you've been visiting our church with a friend, and maybe it's been a little uncomfortable. I want you to consider whether that discomfort may come from being exposed to light. Listen, being exposed to light can feel uncomfortable, especially at first. When Kelly and I are on vacation, we have the privilege to be able to sleep in a little bit. And so my favorite thing to do is to wake her up in the morning by opening up the blinds really quickly. She's not always excited about it. She doesn't sit up and say, "Thank you, dear husband. This is the day that the Lord has made, and I will rejoice and be glad in it." No, she covers her head and says, "Leave me alone." When Jesus begins illuminating things to you, you might start to feel uncomfortable or scared or mad. And maybe this idea that Jesus is God and that demands absolute lordship over your life, it might anger you. Like you're like, how dare he? How dare he try to suggest who I can and can't sleep with? How dare he tell me who he thinks I am is more important than who I think I am? Or to demand absolute authority over my life. I actually think that anger is a good thing because it means the light's coming in. It's hurting your eyes. And maybe you're scared, the idea that he knows all about you. He sees all that you've done. And you don't know whether you should run from him or run to him. That fear is a good sign. The light reveals and the light heals. There's an old hymn that says, "'Tis grace that taught my heart to fear, then grace my fear relieved." Honestly, it's when people are unmoved by Jesus that I'm the most worried about them. Because it means they're totally asleep, totally have their eyes shut, and haven't even begun to open their eyes. My admonition for you is to press through the discomfort. Keep moving towards the light. The light you're encountering is not just revealing, it's healing. And to those who are Christians, Jesus said that those who follow him will not walk in darkness, which means that our lives will radiate with this light. Again, you might ask, well, what does that mean to live with the light of Jesus? It means that you live in a way that glows with the knowledge that you belong to Jesus and Jesus belongs to you. Tim Keller says it means 4 things. It means that we walk with integrity because you know that one day you will answer to God, and on that day everything will be exposed. The second thing is we live with courage because we know that there's going to be times where we do what's right even when no one else is looking. That will put you so out of rhythm with this world that we live in today, right? That it will cause people to wonder what is wrong with you. Third, it means that we live with grace because our life is defined by an extraordinary act of grace in which we are going to remember this morning through communion. And lastly, it means we live with hope. That we have a joy and a constancy that confuses people. That when we are in pain, when we have a health diagnosis, when the pregnancy test is still negative, when money is tight, our life still glows with the knowledge that we belong to Jesus and Jesus belongs to us. And that is something that death cannot take away. The Psalms say that those who look to God are radiant, they glow with hope. I have this picture of the moon. When the world is turned and that we are absent of the sun, God has provided this reflection called the moon to light up the darkness. Friends, as we walk in this world that we are a part of as sons and daughters of the Most High God, we should be the moon. We aren't the sun, but we should be a reflection of the sun in this dark world. Psalm 67 says, "May God be gracious to us and bless us and make his face shine on us so that your ways may be known where? On earth, so that salvation would come among all nations." Today we're going to receive communion, and it hits a little bit differently today because of our message last week where I am the bread of life. There's 2 things that you need when you come to the table. One is hunger. You need to know how much you need him, right? You need to forsake all of your ways and surrender to all of his ways. And the second thing you need is a willingness to come to him completely as your Lord and Savior. I don't say this often when we receive communion at Lifehouse, but I just want to remind you that communion really is for those who have surrendered their life to Christ. That to receive communion outside of surrender really is somewhat blasphemous. It's really kind of a direct affront against what Jesus has done on the cross. And so I would just encourage you and politely ask you to respect that, and that if you don't have a relationship with Jesus, to abstain from communion does not mean that you can't go to the table and receive communion if you have sin in your life. We are sinners in the hands of God. And we have sin, we have struggles. It doesn't mean, but we also surrender those things to the Lord. And so we come to the table as a reminder of the forgiveness of that sin. I'm going to pray for us and then